It's 5:05 and welcome into a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We are tracking a rule this morning out of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. There is a new rule banning TCE, which is a toxic and carcinogenic chemical that takes effect today. The EPA is targeting its use in industrial, commercial, and consumer applications. TCE has been linked to a history of liver and kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and other illnesses. This move also begins the portion of phasing out PCE, which is a similar chemical, within 3 years for most uses. The regulation is part of efforts under the Toxic Substance Control Act to mitigate health risks. TCE and PCE were infamously found in Camp Lejeune's water supply back during the 1980s, exposing over 1 million people to its harmful contaminants. The contamination led to elevated cancer rates and promoted over 500,000 claims for compensation. Advocates like retired Marine Jerry Enzimmer view the ban as a validation of a decades-long fight for justice that he and many other Marines went through. The EPA emphasized the importance of protecting vulnerable populations and workers exposed to these chemicals in industries like dry cleaning, and as well as more industrial uses as well. Experts highlighted the significance of addressing chronic low exposures, as well as advocating for preventative measures and workplace protections to reduce the public health risk. That is one of our top stories this morning that you can read over at CarolinaJournal.com. It's 5:07. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. One of our reoccurring stories over the last few months here on the Carolina Journal News Hour has been the ongoing legal battles and the saga for the high-stakes race in the North Carolina Supreme Court, Republican Jefferson Griffin versus Democrat Allison Riggs. We have been tracking these legal challenges over some in-question ballots, and we've got an update this morning. Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation has really been walking us through this process over the last couple of months. Mitch, thanks for the time this morning. Appreciate it. You've got some new details to bring to our listeners this morning.
That's right. We're seeing a couple of different court actions playing out in this dispute between Jefferson Griffin and Allison Riggs over who will be the Associate Justice on the state Supreme Court for the next 8 years, essentially. We're seeing some action playing out in the state Supreme Court and also at the federal level at the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. A bunch of court filings scheduled for Wednesday in the Fourth Circuit, leading up to oral arguments in Richmond on January 27th. Meanwhile, a very interesting development in the state Supreme Court. Jefferson Griffin filed his latest piece of information this week, and basically he is asking the Supreme Court to focus most intently on one set of voters that he is challenging. People who've been following this to some extent may know that there's this number being thrown out there of 60,000 ballots that have been challenged in the election. Actually, technically, it's about 66,000, and they're in 3 different categories. The largest category, more than 60,000, are the voters who registered to vote and were never asked to provide a driver's license number or a social security number, a mistake made by the State Board of Elections, not by the voters themselves. That's the largest category, and that's the one that's drawn the largest attacks from people on the other side of this dispute. But Griffin is focusing on a smaller group, but one that he says could in and of itself help flip the election from Riggs to him, and that is people who voted from overseas, cast ballots from overseas in the North Carolina election, and did not provide a photo ID. North Carolina's photo ID law applies to almost everyone who votes in person and people who mail in ballots here in the United States. It did not apply, though, according to the State Board of Elections rules, to those who cast ballots in the election from overseas. And the legal argument from Griffin's team has been that's unconstitutional and against the state law. The state law requires photo ID, and if you are voting from overseas, that would be one of the groups of people you would most want to make sure that they are who they say they are. And there were 5,509 ballots cast from overseas that didn't have photo ID. And so Jefferson Griffin is saying, State Supreme Court, if you buy my legal arguments and are willing to go along with this idea that these are illegal votes that should not count in the recent election result, you could go about it in this way. Start with those overseas voters. Force the State Board of Elections to go back and retabulate the results without those votes. And Griffin is saying he and his legal team believe that in and of itself would be enough to flip the election from Riggs to Griffin. And then things would end there, because every other challenge would be moot, because Griffin would have found that the election result would change and he could move forward as the winner in this race. So it's very interesting to see that Jefferson Griffin, after challenging more than 60,000 ballots, is now really honing in on this group first. And he says, if that is not enough in and of itself, the next group to try would be the ones that are only about 260 voters. And those were the voters who never lived in North Carolina, but cast a ballot in this election, which has also been labeled by the Griffin legal team as unconstitutional. He said, if the margin shrinks between Griffin and Riggs in that first group with the 5,509, the 267 voters in that second group, that might be enough to flip things to his way. If after those two groups, Griffin still trails, then you could get to the 60,000 ballots involving the driver's license number or social security number. But it's interesting to see Griffin set that out there as a possible way for the state Supreme Court to move forward on this. Now, of course, we're going to see a reaction from the State Board of Elections, Allison Riggs, and all the other people who are interested in this race as more court filings come in. But that was the major development this week.
Mitch, let me ask you this. You just mentioned, and I think folks are relatively familiar with voter ID now, if you voted in person, as you noted, or by mail in this election, or actually the municipal elections back in 2023, you were required to show some form of valid ID. What was the rationale from the State Board of Elections as to why these overseas voters did not have to follow the same thing as the person that decided to vote absentee and mail in their ballot living in Asheville or whatever the place may be?
The main rationale seems to be that it was too much of a hardship to ask these voters who have to go through a much more extensive process to get their ballot to North Carolina to force them to have the photo ID. The argument on the other side is, well, that's the law. The law
Sure.
is you provide a photo ID and it applies to everyone. And so it should have applied to these voters as well. Remember, from the State Board of Elections vantage point, even if you don't think of them as partisan, and we have a 3-2 board with the 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and a lot of folks who have been watching this have said that this board has acted in partisan ways over and over again during the course of the time that the Democrats have had that 3-2 advantage. But even if you set the partisan argument aside, the State Board of Elections has tended to go in favor of allowing as many people as possible to vote and making it as easy as possible. So that seems to be the rationale why they would say that overseas voters would not have to provide the photo ID, just because it would be too much of a hardship and would block people who otherwise would legitimately have a shot to vote in this election from doing so. That is an argument that hasn't really held water from the folks who've been challenging this. They've said, look, the law says photo ID, you got to provide photo ID. If you didn't, it doesn't matter that you're overseas. And in fact, if you saw the dissent that Richard Dietz wrote in deciding that he didn't want to take the case, he actually sided with Griffin on this issue and wrote that this is a group that you would particularly want to see an ID from because they're overseas. They seem to have less of a connection to North Carolina than the people who are in Charlotte or Asheville or Wilmington who are here. And you would want to make sure that they are who they say they are.
We'll continue the conversation with Mitch Kokai coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get a look at traffic with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Good morning. I have a report of an incident.
You're clear, Nick.
Route.
It's 5:18. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are actually tracking some breaking international news this morning. If you were following the news and keeping track of what was going on yesterday, on day 467 of the Israel-Hamas war, it was confirmed that a ceasefire deal and hostage release agreement had been reached after more than a year, in the case of the hostages, after more than a year in captivity, including Chapel Hill native Keith Siegel. In checking out some news just before 5 o'clock this morning, we are receiving an update as the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, reporting within the hour that a, quote, last-minute crisis has taken place with Hamas holding up Israel's approval of this long-awaited agreement to pause fighting in the Gaza Strip and release dozens of those hostages. Israeli airstrikes, meanwhile, killed dozens of people across the war-ravaged territory over the last 24 hours. With that, Netanyahu's office said that his cabinet won't meet to approve the agreement until Hamas backs down, accusing it of reneging on parts of its agreement in an attempt to gain further concessions in the stalemate. A senior Hamas official said that the terror group, quote, is committed to the ceasefire agreement, which was announced by mediators yesterday afternoon. With that, turning our attention to North Carolina, Pat Harrigan, the congressman out of North Carolina's 10th congressional district, said this yesterday to Carolina Journal, quote, hostages are finally coming home, not by chance, but through strength and decisive leadership. President Trump made it clear, act swiftly or face severe consequences. This isn't just a win for the hostages and their families. It's a reminder to the world that when America leads with boldness, results will follow. Weakness invites chaos. Strength delivers peace and accountability. On October the 7th, during the terrorist attack on Israel, 253 hostages were taken by Hamas, among them Keith Siegel and his wife. She was held captive for 51 days before being released, but Keith has remained in captivity along with 100 other hostages. And again, Keith Siegel, a native of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So that is what we are tracking this morning. A little ambiguous as to what exactly is going on. You will, of course, continue to hear updates throughout the day right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Keeping you updated this morning on the high-stakes race for the North Carolina Supreme Court, Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation is our guest. Now, Mitch, there's obviously been a lot of hay made from Democrats here in the state claiming that Jefferson Griffin is trying to steal this election. He needs to stop with these legal challenges. That's been echoed by not only the Democrat Party, but other folks aligned with Democrats here in North Carolina. Understanding what you just walked us through, does it not kind of play into their hand that he's trying to find chunks of voters to throw out to potentially change these results? Does this not give Democrats maybe more fodder in this continued argument that the Republicans are essentially only suing here because they lost and it's not really whether the law was right or wrong?
Well, there are a couple of arguments to be made. And first of all, anything that Jefferson Griffin does that would change the vote totals at all, Democrats are going to say he's trying to throw out the real election results. So Democrats and their ideological allies, I'm not listening too much about what they're saying on this front because it's almost certain they would be arguing the exact other way if it were Allison Riggs who were trailing by 734 votes in this election. But there are a couple of different things at play here. One is what the State Board of Elections did in this election something that should be challengeable, allowing these thousands of people to vote without ever having collected the proper information when they registered to vote, counting these ballots from overseas voters who didn't provide photo ID, allowing people who never lived in North Carolina to vote in these elections. There is a question about whether all of those things should be challenged. But then there's another question about whether Jefferson Griffin should be able to challenge all of those things and have it affect this election. And I think you're seeing some division even among the people who think that what the State Board of Elections did was wrong, what it did in some respects may have been unconstitutional. some people are willing to say, look, we need to fix this, but it can't change the outcome of this election. What Jefferson Griffin is trying to do is trying to throw out the rules as they were in place, even if they were bad rules, even if they were unconstitutional rules, and he can't be allowed to do this. And I think that's dividing even some people who might support Griffin ideologically and support him and wanted him to win, that they're saying, look, this is not the venue for this. This should be challenged, but not in the context of trying to overturn this election. So the short answer is, yes, this does add more fuel to the Democrats' fire in their argument that Jefferson Griffin is just trying to sue to win the election. But it's not as if he's just making these arguments out of whole cloth. There are legitimate concerns that are being addressed here.
Now, in this briefing that we're talking about, where he's essentially instructing, is probably not the right word used, but instructing the North Carolina Supreme Court to start with these 5,500 ballots, are they obligated to listen to that request, or are they kind of their own body that can handle this any way that they see fit, and they can kind of ignore or take advice from Griffin? How exactly does that work?
Yeah, they definitely do not have to follow what he's saying here. They could actually deal with this in many ways. One thing that could happen is the state Supreme Court could hear the arguments from Griffin, hear the arguments from the State Board of Elections, and decide, hey, this thing's over. We granted a temporary stay, but the stay is going to go away, and we're going to let the State Board of Elections certify the election result, which would basically end the case. That's one way things could turn out. But the state Supreme Court could also say, look, there's some legitimate arguments here, and then it could address all 66,000 ballots at once in some way, or it could take the recommendation from Jefferson Griffin. I think Griffin's legal team probably put this in there as a way to help convince Republican members of the state Supreme Court who might have been a little bit leery about challenging 60,000 plus votes. He's saying, look, I think that this election result is going to change, even if you limit the look at this point, or the review, to the 5,500 votes from overseas voters who had no photo ID. He thinks that if you limit it to just those 5,500 votes, that's probably enough to change the election result and flip it to him. And you would never have to get to the larger, more controversial group of voters who are basically just folks who followed the rules that the State Board of Elections put out in front of them and didn't do anything particularly wrong.
Final question for you this morning, Mitch. The State Board of Elections doesn't really run elections statewide. It's broken out into all 100 counties across the state. So is there going to be maybe some sort of procedural process or issues here because the state board doesn't necessarily have these ballots? Can they throw these out? Do the local boards need to vote to throw that out if that's what the Supreme Court tells them? It seems like there's a lot of potential intermediaries between the actual votes themselves and a potential order from the court.
I'm not exactly sure how it will play out technically, but the order would come to the State Board of Elections, and the State Board of Elections either on its own or probably more likely through orders to the county boards of elections would say, go back and do this to the ballots, then report your results to us, and then we as the state board will take the final action, which is what happens when there is no challenge, that the county boards will tally all their votes, send them to the state puts it together, and then that is what is certified. And that's what would happen in this race. So it won't just be the State Board of Elections gathering all the ballots from all 100 counties and counting them. They would give some instruction to the local boards of elections about what to do and then tally the results. But it'll be very interesting to see if the state Supreme Court does follow this idea that Jefferson Griffin puts forward. And remember that this is all taking place while the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals is also addressing this case. There will be oral arguments before the Fourth Circuit on January 27th, and it's entirely possible the Fourth Circuit might say to a federal trial judge, take this case back from the state Supreme Court. If they do that, then the whole thing at the state Supreme Court level would be moot because the feds would deal with this issue.
It's a complicated matter. Mitch, thank you so much for keeping us up to date on it this morning. Mitch Kokai joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:28, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time to get another look at traffic this morning. We'll head on over and get that update from Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you.
Hot. Good morning again. It's 5:34. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Also streaming live this morning on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. If you miss any portion of the show live, I encourage you to check out the podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour in your favorite podcast app. Tap the subscribe or follow button, and you'll get a new show delivered to your smartphone or tablet each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. One of the stories that we are tracking this morning over at carolinajournal.com is a final rule from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, banning a toxic chemical that was found in Camp Lejeune's drinking water because that is set to take effect today, placing a focus on some of these carcinogen contaminants that are harmful to human health. The chemical is known as TCE, and it is used in a variety of industrial, commercial, and consumer applications, including the industrial cleaning and degreasing, lubricants, adhesive, sealants, paints, dry cleaning. It is carcinogen to all humans by all routes of exposure and is known to cause liver cancer, kidney cancer, and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Since this chemical rose to prominence in terms of the studies and the science behind it, over 500,000 claims for compensation were filed with the U.S. Navy as of last summer for individuals impacted by this chemical contamination at Camp Lejeune, where it was in the water supply. The EPA passed a final rule in December aiming to address the unreasonable risk of injury to health under the Toxic Substance Control Act, and the EPA says anyone who manufactures this and processes or distributes it in commercial uses or disposes of TCE or products containing TCE may be impacted by these new regulations. The phase out of TCE will ban it in manufacturing, processing, and distribution for most products within 1 year. Both TCE and a sister chemical, PCE, were among the chemicals found in drinking water at North Carolina's Camp Lejeune military base back in the 1980s, and one of the worst cases of contaminated drinking water in U.S. history. The base had been operating for more than 3 decades with that contamination, potentially exposing over 1 million service members and their families, according to the CDC. Military members and their families began experiencing cancer and other illnesses at alarming rates, including, listen to this, a 47% higher risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a 50% higher risk of ALS, and a 68% higher percent of multiple myeloma. Wow, shocking numbers there. In 2022, President Biden signed the Honoring Our Pact Act into law, legislation that included the Camp Lejeune Justice Act, allowing all victims to file for relief to seek restitution for disabilities and diseases caused by some of that wrongful exposure at Camp Lejeune. You can read more details on that story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. 5:38, you're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. With all the devastation and destruction out in western North Carolina due to Hurricane Helene, we have talked a lot over the last couple of months about a group called NCORE and their work in the eastern half of the state for some storms that affected eastern North Carolina back at some point 7-8 years ago now. There are still a lot of questions from individuals as to what the state's response is going to be to getting literally thousands of individuals back in their homes and businesses. To get some more details on that this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome Joseph Harris from the John Locke Foundation to the Carolina Journal News Hour to discuss. Joseph, thanks for the time this morning. You've got a piece over at carolinajournal.com this morning. Tell us a little bit about it.
Hello, Nick. Thank you so much for having me on. So, as you mentioned, we have the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, NCORE, which has been in charge of disaster recovery, rebuilding efforts in the eastern part of the state, specifically associated with Hurricane Matthew 2016 and Hurricane Florence 2018. Before we dig a little deeper into NCORE, it's worth noting what was the status quo before NCORE. So before NCORE was actually created, who was supposed to be in charge of the disaster recovery grants that we received from HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, was actually supposed to be the Department of Commerce. That was the status quo going back to the 1990s. But when Hurricane Matthew hit in 2016, we hadn't received money from HUD since 1999, and that was Hurricane Floyd, and that was only about $40 million. So when Hurricane Matthew hit, we really didn't have a system in place to really deal with the disaster recovery and how we're going to administer these hundreds of millions of dollars in grants that we were receiving from the federal government. So at the time, former Governor Pat McCrory decided to bring in the Department of Public Safety to where it wasn't just going to be the Department of Commerce administering the grants. We were also going to have the Department of Public Safety involved. Unfortunately, the Department of Public Safety had zero experience with administering these type of grants, and as a result, it caused delays in the procurement process. So we were having a very difficult time actually getting the rebuilding process going, and that fast forwards us to about 2018 when North Carolina was identified by HUD as a slow spender, meaning we weren't spending the money that they had awarded to us based on their timeline. And so Cooper decided something needed to be done, and Cooper created NCORE. This was Cooper's solution to the delays that were occurring in the first couple of years with these grants. And initially, NCORE was going to still work with the Department of Commerce. However, by 2020, the Department of Commerce was removed from the equation, and it was solely NCORE. And still at this time, though, NCORE was supposed to be a smaller organization. At first, they only had 45 employees, and they were primarily going to be awarding contracts to private organizations that specialize in disaster recovery, and not just disaster recovery, but administering these disaster recovery grants from HUD. However, by 2022, NCORE had decided they no longer wanted to deal with private vendors, and they brought everything in-house. By 2023, they had almost 250 employees. They became a permanent agency, and they were essentially doing everything in-house. They were no longer interested in contracting with the private agencies. And the ultimate result was, unfortunately, in 2024, a $300 million budget shortfall, while only completing about 70% of the homes for the victims of Matthew and Florence. We still have over 1,200 families waiting anywhere from 6 to 8 years for help, which ultimately resulted in the former director of NCORE being let go, and a lot of pressure on Governor at the time, elect Stein, to do something different. And one of Stein's first announcements was that NCORE would continue with their mission in the eastern part of the state, but they would not be taking over the rebuilding efforts in the western part of the state with Helene.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up the size of NCORE. I think one of the most shocking things to me as we've watched these hearings over the last couple of years is how big this entity has grown. And if we're just being honest about it, Joseph, how miserably they failed in their simple task and mission. And maybe simple is not the right word to use, but they had one goal and one objective: get folks back in their homes starting with Hurricane Matthew and then going to Florence. With over 200 employees, they did not accomplish that goal seemingly in any significant fashion. And you still have thousands of people to this day, as we're speaking this morning, that are still without housing.
That's exactly right, Nick. It's kind of amazing to see the 4 or 5 year transformation of NCORE, going from something that was supposed to be a small agency with less than 50 people, that was supposed to be a temporary agency, that was supposed to primarily award contracts to private organizations to then carry out the mission, that then morphs into something that's a relatively large, centralized government bureaucracy that's totally trying to control these projects by themselves. Not only that, they also came under some scrutiny for having, by some people's standards, excessive salaries. They had more than 30 employees making more than $100,000 a year. So that is a big part too, just the swell of the bureaucracy. And it's kind of shocking how little they actually got done. And it seems that disaster recovery can be a difficult business, whether
Sure.
you're the government or the private sector, but it definitely seems as though it's probably something that it's just difficult for the government to get involved in. There's already experts in these fields, and this is what they do. But as you're probably aware, anytime you create any type of government agency, the tendency is for the agency to want to grow. Milton Friedman, famous economist, has a quote that there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program, because once something's created, it's really difficult to to move away from it.
We'll transition into Josh Stein's new group, Grow NC, coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:44, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We'll head on over to the traffic center this morning and get another update on the roadways with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey.
It's 5:49. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We continue to track the high-stakes race for the North Carolina Supreme Court as Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin is challenging more than 60,000 ballots that he claims were potentially cast improperly in that race. In his latest court filing, Griffin is focusing on a little over 5,500 overseas ballots that were submitted without required photo ID, arguing that their exclusion could change the election outcome. In Griffin's 119-page brief filed with the North Carolina Supreme Court, he proposes a phased approach to challenges, starting with those overseas ballots. His lawyers assert that the state election officials violated state law by accepting those ballots without photo ID and argue that the State Board of Elections has disregarded election statutes for years. The court has issued a temporary stay, but has not yet set a timeline for its final decisions. At that same time, the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals is reviewing Griffin's challenge, with hearings scheduled for January the 27th. Riggs will remain in office pending the resolution of these disputes, with her lead affirmed by recounts that took place earlier this year. It's now 5:51. You are listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Continuing our conversation this morning with Joseph Harris from the John Locke Foundation on the Carolina Journal News Hour about NCORE, some of the issues there, a little history lesson as to what we had before NCORE. Now we transition into the Stein administration. And Joseph, as you mentioned, literally his first full day in office, Stein out in Western North Carolina in Asheville, announcing that he's starting this group called Grow NC that is going to be tasked with dealing with the recovery efforts from Hurricane Helene, which by all measures are significantly worse in terms of the long term compared to what we saw with Matthew and Florence, not to minimize those disasters, but literally unprecedented out in the mountains. With that, it's back under the Commerce Department. I appreciate that little history lesson there. So where do we go from here? You've got folks that are still without houses, still living in hotels across the state. What's kind of the first step here for the Stein administration?
That's a great point, Nick, about the level of devastation. Once again, not to minimize Matthew and Florence, but the estimated economic impact of Helene is about 3 to 4 times bigger than what Florence was. So this is going to be a major undertaking for the state. So Stein created Grow NC, and what it appears Grow NC is going to be, it's going to be more of the administrative arm of the disaster recovery. They're primarily going to be tasked with creating the vision for the recovery, also coordinating intergovernmental communication and providing transparent updates to the public. Stein also created within the Department of Commerce the Division of Community Revitalization. And this agency is essentially going to be the one that's going to be taking the place of NCORE for Helene. They're going to be receiving the $1.65 billion in HUD grants that were announced last week that we're going to be receiving from the federal government. They're actually going to be receiving that money, administering that money, and they're going to oversee the rebuilding efforts. It'll be their duty to ensure that the victims of Helene are able to get back into their homes, whether their homes were damaged or destroyed. So I am somewhat interested in Grow NC, specifically in what their vision is going to be, but I'm mostly interested in this Division of Community Revitalization. And I want to see if it's just going to be an agency that is similar to NCORE in a new department, and it's mimicking their action plans and their strategic plans, or if it's something totally different. And here at the Locke Foundation, we're hoping that it's something totally different. It's something more similar to what NCORE was supposed to be, a smaller, leaner organization that doesn't morph into some large bureaucracy that tries to centralize all the decision-making. Instead, they focus on contracting their efforts with private agencies, private organizations that already specialize in this, and really looking at their priorities. So they're going to have to put an action plan out, and HUD's going to have to approve it. And in that action plan, they pretty much have to say how they entail that money. And we're very interested in where they're going to allocate those funds, because that's one thing that NCORE, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, kind of their priorities. They have one job, to get these people back into their homes. But when you look at NCORE's action plans, they had a lot of other side projects. For example, they spent $54 million on affordable housing. They built 752 affordable housing units. And there's, Not saying anything wrong with that, but those are units that are available to anyone below a certain income threshold. So even if you weren't a hurricane victim, you could move into one of these units. Meanwhile, we have 1,200 families still waiting. So we really want this new agency to focus on the direct victims first. And if we have money left over, great. But don't focus on all these side projects. We end up with a $300 million budget shortfall, and we still have families who were directly impacted who were not helped.
We're, of course, talking about that this morning from the lens of the executive branch in regards to former Governor Roy Cooper, now Governor Josh Stein, dealing with that. But the General Assembly has also, they've been very critical of NCORR, hearing after hearing, blasting Laura Hogshead, the former director there. Destin Hall, the new Speaker of the House, announced his select committee on dealing with hurricane relief and recovery. Is it safe to assume that the General Assembly is maybe going to have a much more magnified glass looking at these new organizations with the failures of NCORR? And what role do they play in all of this? I guess they're writing the checks and after all.
Exactly. I do think they're going to play a much larger role than they have in the past, especially after what's happened in the last few months with this budget deficit coming out, and 1,200 families still waiting in the eastern part of the state, and now we have thousands more waiting in the western part of the state. And ultimately, when it comes down to NCORR, because this is something we don't want to forget, we're all focused on the western part of the state now, right? But Stein has allowed NCORR to stay in charge of the eastern part of the state. We have 1,200 families waiting, and they have an agency that's proved to be ineffective that they're depending on. So we don't want to forget about them, but NCORR is essentially out of money. And the only new funding NCORR can get is from the General Assembly, if we're going to complete those houses for Matthew and Florence. Now, when it comes to Helene, we're getting this $1.65 billion from the federal government. And if that goes to this Division of Community Revitalization, as long as they can be fiscally responsible with it, then potentially they won't have too much interference from the General Assembly. But we do expect there be a much closer eye on the rebuilding efforts in the western part of the state. And if we see in the first couple of years, because it was pretty obvious with NCORR, even going back a year or two ago, if you look, that this was going to end badly. They were not being fiscally responsible. They were way behind the timeline. And Laura Hogshead, the former director, probably should have been let go a little sooner, but Cooper waited until the last minute. And what we need to ensure doesn't happen is we repeat that mistake. We need to make sure that this rebuilding effort in Helene, that from the very beginning, there's a lot of public scrutiny. And not only that, but we don't forget about the people in the eastern part of the state who've already been waiting for 6 or 7 years.
Great information and insight this morning. Joseph Harris from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. And that's going to do it for a Thursday edition. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.